The process of globalization in the second half of the 20th century led to the emergence of a new trend in historical science, the so-called new historians, the essence of which is that they are trying to find out what real social phenomena stand behind the discord of various historical schools, expressing one or another purely national or narrow class point of view. One of them, J. Getty, began revising the prevailing ideas about the history of the USSR and the United States and their confrontation throughout the 20th century. He was admitted to work in the archives of Russia. In 2002, Komsomolskaya Pravda, for a month and a half, published a series of articles under the general title The Scarecrow of Stalin, dedicated to the fact that J. Getty excavated in Russian archives according to the theme of dark places in the history of the USSR. Here are some excerpts from this series of articles. Getting acquainted with primary documentary sources of Stalin's time, he made a discovery that led to this publication. J. Getty publicly announced that the ominous 1937 was preceded by approximately 3 years of liberal Stalinist reforms. Moreover, it was precisely the failure of these reforms that led to the repressions that were unfairly named Stalinist. Yes, indeed, Getty made a discovery, says Yuri Zhukov, a leading researcher at the Institute of Russian History of the Russian Academy of Sciences. But since this topic was only an accompanying one for him, he simply carved out a niche for science. And Yuri Nikolaevich showed a document that he himself had discovered in the archives. This is a sample of a ballot paper for the elections to the USSR Supreme Soviet of the First Convocation. In the final version, which this ballot acquired by the election day on December the 12th, 1937, there was only one, alternativeless, as we would say today, candidate from the party and the Komsomol. However, until June 1937, it was still assumed that the elections would be held on an alternative basis. That is, along with a candidate from the party apparatus, workers and employees of a plant could nominate their own candidate, and collective farmers their own one. But only one of the three would pass. The ballot says, leave one candidate, cross out the rest. But what if the voters of 1937, in concord, had crossed out precisely the representatives of the governing party in a single-party country? If millions of such ballots had been taken from the ballot boxes, what a thunderbolt would have burst. The party would have been left without power. But maybe this was just Stalinist populism. However, Yuri Nikolaevich objected. Stalin wanted something else, to remove the party from power altogether. As a commentary to this, it should be noted that J.V. Stalin was a Bolshevik. The party was a legalized Masonic lodge carrying the anti-people policy of Masonic fascism. It was clear that it must be removed from power, and that the slogan of the anti-Masonic Kronstadt uprising, Soviets without communists, should be realized, since true believing communists were either the Freemasons themselves or were inspired by them. Or if one assumes that J.V. Stalin was the leader, the figurehead of the party, then why he should destroy the party from which he feeds, and which fans the censor of his personality cult, is also incomprehensible. All the more, the figurehead is not able to do this. It is not in his competence. Or if he was a dictator, as he is nowadays represented, then why should he factually destroy the party through which he governs, the officials of the apparatus of which observe corporate discipline and ensure his and their personal well-being? After all, he proposes measures directed against the party as a public institution, and not against one or another of its officials personally, or groups of officials within the party whom he might suspect of disloyalty to himself. Further continues the quote. Therefore, he first conceived a new constitution, and then, on its basis, alternative elections. According to the Stalinist project, the right to nominate their own candidates, along with party organizations, was granted to almost all public organizations in the country, trade unions, cooperatives, youth organizations, cultural societies, even religious communities. However, Stalin lost the last battle, and lost it in such a way that not only his career, but even his life was in jeopardy. However, we cannot understand things in this way. Let us start from the very beginning. The new course and the witch hunt. In whose hands, then, were the main reins of governance? The Central Executive Committee or the Politburo? It is not possible to answer unequivocally. These two organs were intertwined. In total, 7 regular congresses of Soviets took place. The 8th, extraordinary one, was unscheduled and was the last. In the periods between congresses, the Central Executive Committee, a kind of parliament which included about 300 people, was called to act. But it almost never met in full numbers. Only the elected by presidium functioned constantly. Were these 300 people at least freed workers? Of course not. They represented both the broad and narrow leadership of the country. As for the presidium of the Central Executive Committee, it included only members of the Politburo and the Council of People's Commissars. The unique paradox of the Soviet system of government in those years was also in its fused branches, but, in essence, one single branch of power, from the crown to the roots, had been occupied by the party apparatus. Factually, regular Freemasonry and Masonified true-believing Marxists. Stalin decided to break all this with the help of the new constitution. Firstly, to separate the executive branch from the legislative branch in the Soviet organs, and separate them from the judicial branch, which was directly subordinate to the People's Commissar for Justice, Krylenko, who was later repressed. Secondly, to separate the party from these power structures and generally prohibit it from interfering in the work of the Soviet organs, leave in its charge only 2 things: campaigning and propaganda, as well as participation in the selection of cadres. Roughly speaking, the party had to take the same place in the life of the country that is occupied by, say, the Catholic Church in the life of Ireland. Yes, it can influence the life of the state, but only morally, through its parishioners. The reform that Stalin conceived was designed to consolidate our society in the face of an almost imminent clash with Nazi Germany. In an aside from the quote, here we will note that the war between the USSR and Germany was being prepared by world Freemasonry for the solution of at least one of 2 tasks: to conduct a demonstrative flogging of nationalism as an opponent of the global biblical project, and to demonstrate against this background the triumph of Marxism. In the event of the strengthening of Bolshevism in the USSR, if not to destroy Bolshevism by external aggression, then to weaken it as much as possible, destroying in the war the potential of its development, as many people as possible, and above all young people in the adult draft age. Further continues the quote. Can you briefly list its main objectives? First, to eliminate the so-called Lishenets. Our note: Lishenets, Lishency, the disenfranchised, were citizens of the country deprived of voting rights. Before the revolution, a significant part of the population was deprived of voting rights according to residency and property qualifications. After the revolution, these were socially alien elements. Stalin decided to grant electoral rights to all citizens, with the exception of those deprived of these rights by court, as is done all over the world. Second, that elections be equal for all social classes and social strata. Before the revolution, all the advantages were with the so-called landowners. That is, landowners who, by default, had the chance to promote many more deputies than representatives of peasants, workers, and townspeople did. After the revolution, the production workers automatically had 5 times more deputies than the peasants. Now their rights were leveled. Third, direct elections. That is, instead of the old multi-stage system, each citizen directly chooses the local, Republican, all-union power. Here we have another side note. Since the right to nominate candidates for deputies was given to the collectives of enterprises and public organizations, the project was aimed at ensuring that the statehood of Soviet power would again begin to be generated from below, as it was everywhere during its formation, and not from above, which was achieved by true-believing Marxists and the inspiring them Freemasonry in the course of the Civil War and the early post-war years. Further continues the quote. Finally, that the elections be by secret ballot, which never happened under either the Tsarist or the Soviet regime. But the most striking, in 1936, Stalin publicly announced that the elections should also become alternative, that is, several candidates per organization should stand for one position, not be nominated, but precisely stand. To be nominated and to stand, what's the difference? You can nominate as many candidates as you like, but to stand for election means the approval of only a certain number of candidates for elections. This was the first attempt to gently, bloodlessly, remove the broad party leadership from power. And factually, Freemasonry, subordinate to it true-believing Marxists, and unprincipled bureaucrats. After all, it is no secret. The first secretary of the Regional Committee of Oblast, or Regional Committee or Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Union Republic, was both Tsar and God on its territory. It was possible to remove them from power only in the customary way, on charges of some sins. But it was impossible to remove everyone at once. Having united at the plenum, they themselves could remove anyone from power. So, Stalin conceived a peaceful, constitutional transition to a new electoral system, and factually towards a new type of statehood of Soviet power. The first secretaries immediately objected that mostly priests would get into the Stalinist parliament. Indeed, more than half at that time was made up of believers. And what would Stalin have done if half of the Supreme Soviet would have been priests? I don't think that the people choosing those they trust would have undermined the power. Rather, they would help to strengthen it. A note aside from the quote. If candidates for deputies were nominated from the collectives, then, given the sentiments that then existed in society, they would nominate precisely those who were more dobrosovicious in labor and better in relations towards people. In other words, the power would not have been shaken, but would have been strengthened, precisely in the quality of all people's power of the Soviets. Back to the quote. On the other hand, Stalin foresaw that the vast majority of the first secretaries, true-believing Marxist extremists and bureaucrats, running for the Supreme Soviet, would, after all, not pass in elections by secret ballot. The people would not forgive them for excesses in collectivization and industrialization, abuse of factually uncontrolled power. It was clear that everyone who would have been denied confidence by the voters in the first elections to the Supreme Soviet would have had to leave their party posts. In precisely such a way, peacefully and bloodlessly, Stalin planned to get rid of the party nobles, to strengthen Soviet power, and his own, of course. But he could not have but understood that he was playing with fire. He understood, but hoped to outplay the partocracy. How? By appealing to the people. That is, to the Bolsheviks among the masses, both party members and non-party people who were either not allowed into the party by the bureaucrats, or who themselves believed that they had not matured enough to assume the truly high at that time title of party member. After all, Stalin realized that it was in him that the people saw the one who was able to curb this partocracy. The trial of Zinoviev and Kamenev in August 1936 was the last point in the fight against the Trotskyist-Zinoviev opposition. The most active periphery of the true-believing Masonic Marxist project. It had not recovered from this blow, but paradoxically, having been escorted out the door, it returned through the window, however, already in the form of a myth. The more realistic and closer the prospect that the country would begin to live according to the new constitution became, the louder the first secretaries shouted about the existence in their territories of broad conspiracies of Trotskyists and Zinovievites, which, allegedly, could disrupt the elections to the Supreme Soviet. The only way to prevent such a threat is to deploy repressions against them. Even from the transcript, one can see that Stalin, Zhdanov, and Molotov insisted on the need to restructure the system of governance to prepare elections in party organizations, emphasizing that until now there had been no genuine elections, only co-optation. That is, the party and bureaucratic elite as a whole invited those they considered necessary to fill vacancies and created not only positions, but also entire structures for the people they needed. Back to the quote. And as an answer, repressions now. Stalin already tells them in plain text, if such and such a comrade is a member of the Central Committee, then he believes that he knows everything. If he is a people's commissar, he is also sure that he knows everything. But that won't work, comrades. We all need to retrain ourselves. And he even uses the obvious trick, referring to the first secretaries. Prepare yourselves 2 good deputies and come to Moscow for retraining. But they were not born yesterday. They understand. This is one of the legal ways to remove a person from his post. Strange. All this happened after the approval of the new constitution, which was adopted by the All-Union Congress of Soviets on December 5, 1936, the democratic merits of which had already been noted by the whole world. And just 2 months later, the struggle broke out with renewed vigor. What was the matter? The wrong constitution was adopted? No, the correct constitution was adopted, the correct one. Even Chapter 11, the electoral system, which Stalin personally wrote and for whose fate he was most concerned, was approved without changes. The last thing that the delegates of the Congress approved was the right to nominate candidates is secured to public organizations. In short, it was a very big victory and a crushing defeat for Stalin's group. In what did the victory consist? There were only 146 articles in the Constitution. For the first time, and only once, the party is mentioned in Article 126 as the leading core of all organizations of toilers, both public and state. That is, no leading role of the party. Such a situation would appear only in the Brezhnev Constitution of 1977, during a new Suslov round of Trotskyism. Our note: this is not an accurate definition of the Brezhnev period. It can rather be characterized as a period of autocracy of the party bureaucracy, which got rid of the leadership of the Marxist neo-Trotskyist of the Khrushchev bacchanalia, a period in which Freemasonry allowed the bureaucracy to quietly degrade as a corporation of professionals governors, providing the opportunity to parasitize with impunity. This organized degradation of the bureaucracy towards parasitism made it possible, over the course of perestroika, to sweep away the party nomenclature regime of the USSR, in general, almost bloodlessly. Further continues the quote. In what did the defeat of Stalin's group consist? Stalin intended to hold elections to the Supreme Soviet at the end of 1936, when the term of the office of the delegates to the 7th Congress of the USSR had expired. This would ensure a smooth transition from the old to the new system of power. But the Congress, that is, true-believing Freemasonry and Marxists, in alliance with the idealist bureaucracy, thwarted the intrigues of Bolshevism, postponed the elections for an indefinite period, and, moreover, transferred to the Central Election Committee the right to approve the regulations on elections and set the date for their holding. 2 years of hard struggle were lost. Everything had to start all over again. This is the whole drama of 1937. Having already tried on a new, reformed model of power, all that remained was to approve its electoral law. The country had not yet broken free from the clutches of the old political system. Ahead lay the June plenum, where they would clash head-on. Komsomolskaya Pravda, November 13th, 2002. The Klubok case. Yuri Nikolaevich, Don't you think that between March and June, a decisive metamorphosis took place in Stalin? The ink had not yet dried on the new constitution, and already it was grossly violated. In April 1937, under the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR, 3 unconstitutional bodies of power were created at once: a commission for resolving issues of a secret nature, some sort of economic commission, and the USSR Defense Committee in the place of the abolished Council of Labor and Defense. In all 3 cases, the same names: Stalin, Molotov, Voroshilov, Kaganovich, Yezhov, sometimes diluted with 2 or 3 more: Mikoyan, Chubar. It was the 5, it became the 7, but that's not the point. The essence is in the fact that by denying the party, the Stalinist group usurped power through the party. Do you agree with that? Of course. The struggle had entered its last stage, and what happened in April, according to all classical canons, is defined as a palace coup. The centrist group was well aware that if it missed the initiative, the next plenum of the Central Committee could simply sweep it away. Having established itself in the central organs of the party and state, it itself launched a purge and shake-up of the higher party apparatus. But it would be a mistake to think that the Stalinists only had enemies in the broad leadership. By the way, being a Stalinist at that time meant being a supporter of the new course, and only among the highest partocracy, Masons of the Marxist branch and true-believing Marxists under their control, did this word sound with a clearly negative connotation. I want to dwell on one more figure, but then you will probably jump out of your chair. But once I could not have imagined that the USSR prosecutor, Andrei Yaniarovich Vyshinsky, was a man of liberal views. Vyshinsky was also a liberal. Is it not to such people that the word Stalinist owes its commonly understood meaning? Read the minutes of the Politburo of those years. There is something to be amazed at. In 1935, barely having become a prosecutor, Vyshinsky demanded a review of the decision to expel the so-called socially alien elements from Leningrad. After the assassination of Kirov, the NKVD, at that time a kind of Gestapo of the regime of Freemasons and true-believing Darksists, cleansed the city of former nobles, senators, generals, and intelligentsia. Almost 12,000 people were deprived of political and civil rights. Many were convicted on trumped-up charges. The Politburo, where the 5, J.V. Stalin and his comrades, set the tone, supported the prosecutor's protest. Most of the disenfranchised were able to return to Leningrad. Their convictions and charges were removed from them, their voting rights were restored, and their unpaid pensions were given. 1936. Vyshinsky seeks the abolition of court sentences under the law of August 7, 1932, the so-called Law of Three Spikelids, from which 1 million peasants suffered for absolutely minuscule theft of socialist property. Now this 1 million peasants were also able to participate in the first elections to the Supreme Soviet. 1937. The USSR prosecutor insisted on a review of the cases of engineers and technicians of the coal industry and demanded the rehabilitation of all those who were involved in the Industrial Party trial. Both received orders, titles, and, of course, the right to elect and be elected. That is, the Industrial Party trial was organized and falsified not by the Bolsheviks, but by the regime of the Freemasons and true-believing Marxists. Well, how can a serious historian, reading all this in succession, fail to come to a completely unambiguous conclusion that the period of mass repression was preceded by a period of liberalization, albeit forced but justified by the struggle for power? And then ask the precise question: what prevented the continuation of the course? What catastrophe cut it off? Did I correctly grasp your conception? In order to ensure the triumph of the initiated political reform, Stalin decided to become dictator for an hour? Whether Stalin had such an intention, one can only guess. For 65 years, Historians have dreamed of seeing one investigation file, which is now hidden in the FSB archives because it holds the key to understanding what happened between March and June 1937. However, it is impossible to reach it. The Klubok case? How did you know? From your book, Secrets of the Kremlin, from your articles. But how did you know, since this is such an archival secret? You see, from time to time our security services like to show themselves off. They say they have no secrets from the general public, archival documents are released in scanty circulation, and then they say, well, of course, we not only declassified, but also published. So it was several years ago in Kazan, with the collection Heinrich Grigorievich Yagoda, Documents and Materials. The circulation was 300 copies. I had to use all my connections to get one of them, and most historians remain in the dark about the fact that the precedent for declassifying the Klubok case has, after all, taken place. The collection contains the minutes of the interrogations of Yagoda, who, being the chief Chekist, missed the conspiracy against Stalin's group. In other words, he himself not only participated in it, but also provided cover. There was success in finding interrogations of some of the main participants in the conspiracy, in particular, the Kremlin commandant, Peterson. He was detained in Kiev in April 1937, and this began a wave of arrests in the army. Many names revealed in the conspiracy literally shocked Stalin, but especially two, Yanukidze and Tukhachevsky. Yuri Nikolaevich, isn't this conspiracy a myth? Maybe it is precisely the myth that is classified? More likely there is another reason. Peterson, who was responsible for the protection of the highest officials of the state, knew all the premises of the Kremlin, knew where the leading five usually met. In his testimony, he says that he needed no more than 10 to 15 people to arrest them. When did this Klubok conspiracy actually arise? In 1934-1935. This was a reaction to Stalin's new course, which began with joining the League of Nations and was continued in the development of a new constitution for the country. And here is what, from my point of view, is important to note. This is a new type of opposition that has nothing to do with the old ideological ones. For the first time, orthodox communists, apparatchiks, and the military, that is, true-believing communists, initiated into the variants of global political scriptwriting, Freemasons and idealist bureaucrats power lovers, had united in it. But here begins a purely detective novel, which we historians have to conjecture for the characters. Komsomolskaya Pravda, November the 14th, 2002. And yet, what do we know absolutely reliably? We know that on June the 2nd, 1937, Stalin arrived at an expanded meeting of the Military Council under the USSR People's Commissar of Defense. After Voroshilov's report, which announced the arrest of Tukhachevsky, Putna, Kork, Yakir, Ubarievich, and other commanders involved in the conspiracy, Stalin also spoke. There is no doubt that the Kremlin plot, which was revealed right on the eve of the June 1937 plenum, was a severe blow for Stalin. He lost support in the army, and now, in the further struggle against party dogmatists, true-believing Marxists and the part of the bureaucracy under their control, he could rely only on the NKVD. The blood began to flow. Explain to me one riddle, Yuri Nikolaevich. Stalin learned, back in January 1935, that a ramified party military plot had developed against him, but only in May 1937 did he unleash his anger on the conspirators. Almost 2.5 years to watch for the moment for reprisals. Stalin divided the participants in the conspiracy, or rather his possible opponents, and he did so within the administrative framework. He appointed them to different places, necessarily under the control of the NKVD, disconnected them so as to hinder their contacts, to break their game. And if the Klubok case had disintegrated by itself, perhaps that would have been the end of the matter. But unfortunately it did not disintegrate, and Stalin knew it. When the hour of the main battle came, he decided to show his fist in advance. So it was a preemptive strike on his part. Yes, and not one. The second preemptive blow was struck at the partocracy. The meaning of the purge undertaken was quite clear. By dumping the first ballast, Stalin made it clear that real power was in his hands, and those who would resist the new electoral law could suffer the same fate. In short, the tone was set. And at that moment, from my point of view, the Stalinist team made a very serious mistake. By the fact that they brought the fire on themselves? I would say differently. By the fact that they forced the party leadership to unite. Were the first secretaries on the lists of the ostracized? 4 people: Razumov, Shibaldayev, Lavrentiev, Kartvilishvili, and Rumyantsev, who respectively represented the East Siberian Regional Committee, Kursk, Crimean, and Western Smolensk-Bryansk regional party committees of oblasts. These were the most notable figures among the 28 disgraced persons. However, what specific offense before the party and the country they were accused of was never mentioned. It was supposed that the NKVD would sort it out. It was in the very amorphousness, abstractness of the accusations that could be brought against any participant in the plenum, and was the purpose of this preventive strike in the case, that the higher party apparatus would try to block the adoption of the new electoral law. And how did the apparatus endure this blow? As it is said, silently. Nobody asked a single question. Everyone voted in favor. But on June the 28th, the day of the opening of the plenum, far from all the members of the Central Committee arrived in Moscow. They were traveling by train. It seemed that victory could be celebrated. But the euphoria that lulled the vigilance of Stalin's team lasted exactly one day, June the 28th. On this day, on the sidelines of the plenum, there was a plot of the first secretaries, who had time to think about how to respond to the general line of the Politburo. That is, Freemasonry and true-believing Marxists, together with a part of bureaucrats loyal to them, rallied against the line of Bolshevism which had seized the Politburo. It was June the 29th. The plenum was already ending, when a note was received from the first secretary of the Regional Party Committee of the Novosibirsk Oblast, R.I. Eicher, to the Politburo, in which he asked the Politburo to temporarily endow him with emergency powers in the territory under his jurisdiction. In the Novosibirsk Oblast, he wrote, a powerful, huge in number, anti-Soviet counter-revolutionary organization which the NKVD authorities were unable to completely liquidate, had been uncovered. It was necessary to create a troika in the following composition: the first secretary of the Regional Party Committee of Oblast, the regional prosecutor of Oblast, and the head of the regional department of the NKVD, with the right to make operative decisions on the exile of anti-Soviet elements and the imposition of death sentences on the most dangerous of these persons. That is, factually, a military field court, without defenders, without witnesses, with the right to immediate execution of sentences. Eicher motivated his request, saying that in the presence of such a powerful counter-revolutionary organization, elections to the Supreme Soviet could bring an undesirable political result. Eicher, R.I., 1890 to 1940, party member from 1905, participant of the revolution and the struggle for Soviet power in Latvia. From 1925, chairman of the Siberian Regional Executive Committee, first secretary of the West Siberian Regional Committee of the CPSUB. From 1937 to 1938, People's Commissar of Agriculture of the USSR. From 1930, a member of the Central Committee. From 1935, candidate member of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, member of the Central Executive Committee of the USSR. How can one explain why Stalin and his group, which at previous plenary sessions of the Central Committee had repeatedly fought off the demands of the party apparatus to introduce repressions, this time tacitly accepted the position of the majority? Were they afraid to lose? But the choice they made led to the defeat not only of the new course, they themselves lost face forever. My explanation boils down to the fact that if the Stalinist group had gone against the majority, it would have been immediately removed from power. It would have been enough for the same Eiche, if he had not received an affirmative resolution for his appeal to the Politburo, or Khrushchev, or Postyshev. Postyshev is another supposedly innocent victim of Stalinism, about whose death in repressions N.S. Khrushchev expresses regret in his report to the 20th Congress of the CPSU. Or anyone else. They could have gone up to the podium and quoted Lenin, where he spoke about the League of Nations or about Soviet democracy. It would have been enough to pick up the program of the Comintern, approved in October 1928, where they wrote down as a model the system of governance that was fixed in our Constitution of 1924 and which Stalin tore to pieces when the new constitution was adopted. It would have been enough to present all this as an accusation of opportunism, revisionism, betrayal of the October Revolution, betrayal of the interests of the party, betrayal of Marxism-Leninism, and that's it. In this regard, let us mention the publication in Pravda during this period of J.V. Stalin's answer to the question about anti-Semitism in the USSR. In those conditions, it was not only a notification to the Bolsheviks about the Masonic fascistic character of the regime in the USSR, but also the anticipatory statement of J.V. Stalin of loyalty to the top leadership of world Freemasonry and its masters. I think Stalin, Molotov, Kaganovich, Voroshilov would not have survived until the end of June. They would have been unanimously withdrawn from the Central Committee and expelled from the party at that very moment, handing over the case to the NKVD. And the same Yezhov, with the greatest pleasure, would have conducted a lightning-fast investigation into their case. If the logic of this analysis is brought to its conclusion, then I do not exclude such a paradox that today Stalin would be among the victims of the repressions of 1937. And Memorial is an international historical civil rights society which was formally established in Moscow in January 1989. And the commission of A.N. Yakovlev would long ago have procured his rehabilitation. This is the case when representatives of the official schools of historical science, who know many historical facts in detail, do not understand the role of Freemasonry in making global politics and the politics of states, both foreign and domestic. All claims against J.V. Stalin are conditioned not by repressions as such, but by the fact that he thwarted the implementation of the Masonic Marxist project, eliminating many Masons, but the millions of common folk who died before and after these repressions, about whom humanists and human rights activists from Freemasonry simply do not care a fig, would not have been remembered if J.V. Stalin had not buried the Marxist project. These are claims on the part of Freemasonry about the death of brothers. And if J.V. Stalin had been repressed in 1937, then only specialist historians would have known of him now, and would have known him precisely as a perverter of Marxism and a revisionist, who suffered a punishment which was well deserved from the point of view of the top of Freemasonry, and the question of his rehabilitation simply could not have been raised with the preservation in the country of the Masonic Marxist inter-Nazi fascistic regime. The question of the rehabilitation of a part of the repressed was raised in the 1950s in connection with the fact that Bolshevism had been drained of blood during the Great Patriotic War, and was incapable of resisting the bureaucracy and the Masoning Marxists. The question of a new round of rehabilitation arose during the years of Perestroika, owing to the fact that the bureaucracy had finally degraded, and Freemasonry decided to demonstrate who in the house was boss. Back to the interview. But that would have been if he had said no, but he said yes. What difference does it make to the millions of people to whom this terrible compromise caused so much misery? Why did it happen? And how was the soul of Comrade Stalin tormented at the same time? You know, there is a difference. If there had not been, the story would have gone differently. After all, already in 1938, Stalin was taking revenge. Almost all the participants in this plenum, who, having beaten Stalin, smashed his new course into smithereens, themselves came under repression, this time actually Stalinist. Here we note that Stalin was not taking revenge, but performing an act of social hygiene. Now let us turn to N.S. Khrushchev's version of the same events mentioned in his report to the 20th Congress. An example of vile provocation, of odious falsification, and of criminal violation of revolutionary legality is the case of the former candidate for the Central Committee Politburo, one of the most eminent workers of the party and of the Soviet government, Comrade Robert Eicher, who had been a party member since 1905. Comrade Eicher was arrested on April 29, 1938, on the basis of slanderous materials without the sanction of the state prosecutor of the USSR. This was finally received 15 months after the arrest. The investigation of Eicher's case was made in a manner which most brutally violated Soviet legality and was accompanied by willfulness and falsification. Under torture, Eicher was forced to sign a protocol of his confession, prepared in advance by the investigative judges. In it, he and several other eminent party workers were accused of anti-Soviet activity. On October 1, 1939, Eicher sent his declaration to Stalin, in which he categorically denied his guilt and asked for an examination of his case. In the declaration, he wrote, "There is no more bitter misery than to sit in the jail of a government for which I have always fought." R.I. Eicher did not notice that the structure had changed. A second declaration of Eicher has been preserved, which he sent to Stalin on October 27, 1939. In it, Eicher cited facts very convincingly and countered the slanderous accusations made against him, arguing that this provocatory accusation was, on one hand, the work of real Trotskyites, whose arrests he had sanctioned as first secretary of the West Siberian Regional Party Committee, and who conspired in order to take revenge on him, and, on the other hand, the result of the base falsification of materials by the investigative judges. Eicher wrote in his declaration, "On October 25th of this year, I was informed that the investigation in my case has been concluded, and I was given access to the materials of this investigation. Had I been guilty of only 1/100th of the crimes with which I am charged, I would not have dared to send you this pre-execution declaration. However, I have not been guilty of even one of the things with which I am charged, and my heart is clean of even a shadow of baseness. I have never in my life told you a word of falsehood, and now, finding both feet in the grave, I am still not lying. My whole case is a typical example of provocation, slander, and violation of the elementary basis of revolutionary legality." The confessions which were made part of my file are not only absurd, but contain slander toward the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, and toward the Council of People's Commissars. This is because correct resolutions of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, and of the Council of People's Commissars, which were not made on my initiative and were promulgated without my participation, are presented as hostile acts of counter-revolutionary organizations made at my suggestion. I am now alluding to the most disgraceful part of my life and to my really grave guilt against the party and against you. This is my confession of counter-revolutionary activity. The case is as follows. Not being able to suffer the tortures to which I was submitted by Z. Ushakov and Nikolaev, Ushakov Z.M., Nikolaev Zhurid N.G., employees of the NKVD, arrested in 1939. In January 1940, they were shot by the verdict of the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR. Especially by the former, who utilized the knowledge that my broken ribs have not properly mended and have caused me great pain, I have been forced to accuse myself and others. The majority of my confession has been suggested or dictated by Ushakov. The rest is my reconstruction of NKVD materials from Western Siberia, for which I assumed all responsibility. If some part of the story, which Ushakov fabricated, and which I signed, did not properly hang together, I was forced to sign another variation. The same thing was done to Moisey Ruchimovich, who was at first designated as a member of the reserve net, and whose name later was removed without telling me anything about it. The same was also done with the leader of the reserve net, supposedly created by Bukharin in 1935. At first I wrote my own name in, and then I was instructed to insert Valery Mezhlauk's. There were other similar incidents. I am asking and begging you that you again examine my case, and this not for the purpose of sparing me, but in order to unmask the vile provocation which, like a snake, wound itself around many persons in a great degree due to my faint-heartedness and criminal slander against me. I have never betrayed you or the party. I know that I perish because of vile and mean work of enemies of the party and of the people, who have fabricated the provocation against me. Ruchimovich M.L., 1889 to 1938, a party member from 1913, an active participant in the October Revolution and the Civil War in Ukraine. From 1920, chairman of the Donetsk Provincial Executive Committee. From 1925, in government and party work, People's Commissar of the Defense Industry of the USSR. From 1924, a member of the Central Committee of the party. Mezhlauk V.I., 1893 to 1938, party member from 1917. From 1920, Commissar of a number of railways. In government work, Deputy Chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR. From 1927, a candidate member of the Central Committee. From 1934, member of the Central Committee of the CPSUB. In short, an excellent illustration on the theme, people who live in glass houses. In the conditions when the anti-Masonic resolutions of the Second and Fourth Congresses of the Comintern were consigned to oblivion, both in the CPSUB and in the Comintern, for both Freemasons and true-believing Marxists, that is, accomplices of inter-Nazi Masonic fascism, enemies of Bolshevism, there was no opportunity to juridically formalize the repressed. Therefore, it was necessary in a number of cases to write deliberate lies and nonsense in the official legal cases of the repressed. But the Stalinist repressions, however, were personally targeted, well-grounded, and it was known who and for what. However, N.S. Khrushchev did not tell the Congress anything about the activities of R.I. Eicher, which preceded his arrest, from which it can be understood that in the opinion of the authors of the report on the cult of personality and its consequences, the inter-Nazi fascist R.I. Eicher did not commit any crimes against the higher-ups of the Masonic Marxist project of enslavement of Russia. Further, the continuation of publications in Komsomolskaya Pravda. Okay, let's return to the first period of Stalinist repressions. What happened after Eicher's note received an affirmative resolution from the Politburo right there at the plenum? Having dispersed to their seats, the most nimble party secretaries, by July the 3rd, sent similar requests to the Politburo about the creation of extrajudicial troikas. Our note. Factually, the leaders of Freemasonry, foreseeing that they would lose power for many years, struck a preemptive blow. They had to execute as many people as possible. First of all, the best specialists in various industries and regions, in order to weaken the USSR under the rule of the Stalinist Bolshevik bureaucratic regime and simplify aggression against it. At the same time, the governors of global politics sacrificed their true-believing Marxist periphery in the USSR, foreseeing that in any case the initiators of this event would have to answer for sabotage. Back to the quote. What is more, in them they immediately indicated the intended scale of repression. During July, such cipher telegrams came from all the territories of the Soviet Union. Nobody abstained. This irrefutably proves that there was a conspiracy at the plenum, and it was only important to create a precedent. Here in front of me is a photocopy of several cipher telegrams from the Russian State Archives of Contemporary History, which were recently declassified for purely propagandistic purposes. Already on July 10th, 1937, the Politburo reviewed and approved the 12 applications that came first: Moscow Oblast, Kuibyshev Oblast, Stalingrad Oblast, the Far Eastern Territory, Dagestan, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Belarus. I added up the numbers. In this one day alone, permission was given to subject 100,000 people to repression. 100,000. Such a terrible scythe has never swept over our Russia. Moreover, half of its first harvest fell in the Moscow Oblast, which is by no means the largest in the country. The troika formed here included, as is apparent, the first secretary of the Regional Party Committee of Moscow Oblast, N.S. Krushchev. Next to his surname and signature, there is always the surname and signature of Ryedins, the head of the NKVD department for the Moscow Oblast, a relative of N. Alliluyeva, Stalin's second wife. She committed suicide on the night of November 7th, 8th, 1932. Ryedins today is also on the list of victims of Stalin's tyranny. So, Khrushchev and Ryedins presented, however, I'd rather quote their request to the Politburo: to be executed, gulags 2,000, criminals 6.5 thousand, for deportation, gulags 5,869, criminals 26,936, and that is just one sweep of the scythe. Did it keep on sweeping? Of course. After all, one-time limits were released for each territory. That is, the Politburo, nevertheless, imposed certain restrictions, finding that requests from the localities were too high. This was nothing. They adapted to this. After a month or 2 or 3, some of the first secretaries requested new limits, and they got them. Limits for execution. Lord, and how could the Russian language withstand these monstrous words? Moreover, for execution, rounded off limits. For deportation, almost with fractions. Why? It is clear that the numbers were taken from thin air, and if they were rounded off, or deliberately presented in the form of accurate calculations, then what's the difference? Here we have an application from Dagestan. 600 people to be executed, 2,485 people to be deported. But now let's think about it. And where, for example, in Moscow Oblast in the summer of 1937, when the struggle against the gulags had long since sunk into oblivion, did almost 8,000 gulags suddenly appear from, and more than 33,000 criminals? What were these criminals and gulags? Until historians are given the opportunity to precisely, according to the documents, verify who these people were, we are able only to assume. But let me state my assumption, especially since I am deeply convinced of it. Judging by the number of repressed people, these are, first of all, the same peasants from whom, quite recently, just a little over a year before, Stalin and Vyshinsky had removed their convictions under the law of 3 spikelets, and to whom they returned voting rights in the hope that they would forgive Soviet power for its revolutionary excesses and would now vote for its new constitutional and parliamentary system. But the apparatus outplayed Stalin, not only in the elections on December the 12th, 1937, but also for a good 50 years further. That year, by the way, a whole year later than Stalin had planned, the CEC ceased to exist, and the Supreme Soviet of the USSR took its place. But should I tell you what kind of Soviet parliament we got, and why even Stalin did not have a heart for it? I can guess. Eicher went to the Supreme Council. All the firsts passed. Now imagine people's representatives like Eicher, who shot so many people so that there would never be any real elections in the country, and from nowhere they voluntarily adopt the law that permits them. I will only add, in the spring of 1938, having spent only a few months in the post of People's Commissar of Agriculture, Eicher was arrested and shot. Revenge. We once again note, he did not take revenge, but carried out an act of social hygiene. And the words of A.Y. Vyshinsky, that these enemies of the people should be shot like mad dogs, are not empty words, but correspond to the real organization of the psyche structure of these types, and the danger they pose to others in society, especially if they are in bodies of power. Back to the quote. How was it managed to put a stop to the bloody scythe? Throughout the second half of 1937, cipher telegrams poured into the Politburo with requests to increase the limits for the first category, executions, and the limits for the second category, deportation from the territory. Naturally, under the conditions of repression, there was no time for alternative elections. Just imagine the following situation. At polling station number such and such, a candidate from the party fails, and a candidate from a public organization wins. The local troika would immediately weave for him a case and put him under execution or send him to the gulag. This threatened to take on such proportions that the country could slide into a new civil war. In October, the plenum of the party met again for the third time during this terrible year. I have recently managed to find a unique document in the archives. On October the 11th, 1937, at 6 o'clock in the evening, Molotov signed a final renunciation of the Stalinist idea of competitive elections. In return, the plenum approved the alternativeless principle of one candidate, one seat, which automatically guaranteed the partocracy an absolute majority in the Soviet parliament. That is, 2 months before the elections, it had already won. Our note, that is, the conspiratorial Freemasonry and the egoistic bureaucracy were able to gain a foothold on important strategic lines, from which Bolshevism did not have time to throw them off before the start of the war. And after the war, it no longer had the strength for this, since several generations of Bolsheviks died in the battles of the Great Patriotic War. Back to the quote. You spoke about Stalin's revenge on these winners. You must understand, in 1937, there was not yet the all-powerful dictator Stalin. There was the all-powerful collective dictator named Plenum. Our note. There never was the all-powerful dictator J.V. Stalin. At first, there was the dictatorship of Freemasonry and true-believing Marxists. Then, there was a dual power, Freemasonry and Bolshevism, in the struggle for influence over the true-believing Marxists and the bureaucracy. The dual power was replaced by the dictatorship of the bureaucracy, which Bolshevism, exsanguinated by the Great Patriotic War, could not effectively resist due to the absence of a sociological theory alternative to Marxism. Sociological theory, which would include an effective theory of knowledge, governorially consistent philosophy, psychology, from which there would be practical outlets into pedagogics and psychiatry, economic science. Back to the quote. It was the main stronghold of the Orthodox Party bureaucracy, represented not only by the first secretaries, but also by the People's Commissars of the USSR, a large party, and state officials. Malenkov made the keynote speech at the January 1938 plenum. He said that the first secretaries did not even pull the lists of convicts by the troikas out of thin air, but only 2 lines indicating their number. Openly threw an accusation against the first secretary of the Regional Party Committee of Krushchev Oblast, P.P. Postishev. You imprisoned the entire party and Soviet apparatus of the region. To which Postishev replied in the style that, yes, he had arrested, he was arresting, and would continue to arrest until he destroyed all enemies and spies. Our note. But, as N.S. Khrushchev informs in his report at the 20th Congress, P.P. Postishev, at the February-March 1937 plenum of the Central Committee, said something quite different. I have philosophized that the severe years of fighting have passed. Party members who have lost their backbones have broken down or have joined the camp of the enemy. Healthy elements have fought for the party. These were the years of industrialization and collectivization. I never thought it possible that after this severe era had passed, Karpov and people like him would find themselves in the camp of the enemy. Karpov was a worker in the Ukrainian Central Committee whom Postishev knew well. Back to the quote. And now, according to the testimony, it appears that Karpov was recruited in 1934 by the Trotskyites. I personally do not believe that in 1934, an honest party member who had trod the long road of unrelenting fight against enemies for the party and for socialism would now be in the camp of the enemies. I do not believe it. I cannot imagine how it would be possible to travel with the party during the difficult years and then, in 1934, join the Trotskyites. It is an odd thing. Our note. Quote from N.S. Khrushchev's report on the cult of personality and its consequences. However, for some reason, N.S. Khrushchev did not cite the opinion of the same P.P. Postishev of the October 1938 version and explain such a striking difference from the opinion of a year and a half before. Back to the quote. But he found himself in dangerous isolation. 2 hours after this controversy, he was demonstratively removed from the candidates for membership in the Politburo, and none of the participants in the plenum rose to his defense. Even Khrushchev, who also suffered from Malenkov in that report. In exactly 15 years, these 2 people would be the main contenders for the place of the late leader, which is why it is so interesting to understand the origins of their confrontation. Yes, Malenkov said in his report that a verification on deportations from the party and arrests carried out in Moscow revealed that the majority of those convicted were not guilty of anything at all. However, in January 1938, Khrushchev preferred to remain silent, to pretend that this criticism had nothing to do with him. Our note. He also did not remember in 1956, and G.M. Malenkov, for some reason, did not remind him of how it was in reality. Back to the quote. The fact is that precisely at the January plenum, he was dismissed from the post of First Secretary of the Regional Committee of Moscow Oblast and the Moscow City Committee of the Communist Party, and was appointed First Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine. Our note. In other words, he received a promotion instead of being dismissed from his job and answering in court for abuse of power. This is one of the indicators that J.V. Stalin was not omnipotent and was forced to work with those people who there were. Back to the quote. And very soon after he took up his new position, a cipher message came from Kiev to the Politburo. Khrushchev immediately requested limits on the first and second categories for 30,000 people. And Stalin signed again, including for his future whistleblower? Tell me, well, this struggle of the two-faced against the two-faced, this plenum of duplicity, what could it give? Yes, but it was precisely this plenum that first said something intelligible about what was happening in the country. It adopted a resolution with a very long title on errors of party organizations in expelling communists from the party, on formal bureaucratic attitudes towards the appeals of those expelled from the VKPB, and on measures to eliminate these shortcomings. But of course, this decree, which in a veiled form spoke of terror, could not stop it. To do this, it was necessary to break the connection between the party democracy and the NKVD. Our note: the connection between party apparatus bureaucracy and NKVD bureaucracy. Back to the quote. Which had taken the form of a dangerous consolidation at the level of local organizations. And, above all, Yezhov had to be removed from this connection. Our note: N.I. Yezhov was appointed to the post of People's Commissar of Internal Affairs in order to prevent this connection, but did not cope with the mission. The consequences of his sabotage, as far as possible, had to be corrected by L.P. Beria. Back to the quote. Former party worker N.I. Yezhov became the People's Commissar of Internal Affairs in October 1936. At first, all his activities in the new position boiled down to the arrest of about 4,000 Trotskyists and Zinovievites. But when he was allowed to arrest Tukhachevsky, Yakir, Ubarievich, and other prominent military figures, then members and candidates for members of the Central Committee, and then, on the eve of the June plenum, deputy chairmen of the Council of People's Commissars Rudzutaks and Antipov, that is, figures of the first row, the NKVD, like any punitive system in all countries and at all times, began to get a taste. Now hidden enemies were everywhere. Rapidly increasing the scale of repression, Yezhov made it clear how much the party and the country needed him, needed his repressive apparatus. Komsomolskaya Pravda, November 19th, 2002. Our note: this is the behavior of a typical bureaucrat. If there is no real work, then he creates the appearance of work, for reporting to his superiors about his usefulness and irreplaceability. Back to the quote. When did Stalin decide to stop the NKVD? It is usually believed that the impetus for this was the sudden arrest in July 1938 of V.Y. Chubar, deputy chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, that is, Molotov himself. This seriously upset the balance of power in the Politburo. Out of 15 votes, the Stalinist group had 7. After Chubar's arrest, only 6 remained. But this was that same commission for resolving issues of a secret nature, which, contrary to the new constitution, usurped power in the country. Absolutely right. Yezhov was also a member of this commission. That is, the struggle began at the very top of the pyramid, and when the NKVD removed Chubar from the 7, Stalin decided to issue a second warning to Yezhov. And the first? You didn't say anything about the first one. Well, Yezhov accepted the first one with great happiness. In April 1938, he was appointed, concurrently, also as the People's Commissar of Water Transport. The second warning was issued in August. Stalin and Molotov spent 4 whole hours persuading Yezhov to agree to the candidacy of L.P. Beria as their first deputy. And here is the third, final act of this long procedure. On November the 23rd, Yezhov was again summoned to Stalin, with whom Molotov and Voroshilov were already. I was able to hold in my own hands a document that Yezhov had written clearly under their dictation. It is written on 3 pages, all of different sizes. That is, they grabbed the first pieces of paper that they could get their hands on and slipped them to Yezhov so that he would not stop writing. The wording of his removal from office changes twice. To all appearances, he resisted, objected. And it was necessary to wrest from him the decision to leave of his own free will. Immediately a draft resolution was written, which sounds like a guarantee. To keep for Comrade Yezhov the posts of Secretary of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, chairman of the Control Commission of the party, and People's Commissar of Water Transport. Finally, the statement was written and signed N. Yezhov. It was with this that the elimination of Yezhovism began. The Politburo sent telegrams to the localities with plain text to immediately end the repression and disband the troikas. Once again, seizing the initiative, the Stalinist group, already at the end of 1938, secured the first trials of NKVD workers accused of falsification and contrivance of cases in which thousands of people were tried, exiled, and executed over almost a year. This is how the Great Terror was stopped. And thus began, as I understand it, the second wave of repressions, the Terror of Revenge, which now descended on the heads of the initiators of the Great Terror. But the misfortune is that after all, the country did not emerge from this spiral of violence. Indeed, it would have been better if Stalin had rejected the trial balloon of Acre at the risk of his own life, then allowed this on a national scale. Would it have stopped the Great Terror? Yes, undoubtedly. Stalin's affirmative resolution on the note of the party secretary of Novosibirsk is not just his monstrous mistake, but also a crime. The first secretary of the Central Committee of the party factually allowed the partocracy to create their own military field courts. Our note: this was not a crime, but a forced tactical step, because he did not have cadres in order to resist the idealist bureaucracy of the apparatus, true-believing Marxists inspired by Freemasonry. In N.I. Yezhov, who was in advance promoted to the post of People's Commissar of Internal Affairs in order to subordinate the NKVD to the Bolsheviks, J.V. Stalin was deceived. The victims, unfortunately, found themselves in the position of grass on the battlefield. Conclusion: do not be grass. Back to the quote. Therefore, Stalin is not relieved of responsibility for the terror unleashed in the country. For all that, he was not the initiator of the terror. The initiators were others. This means that we are obliged to also verify the alternative version. And if it were not for this personal mistake, this personal crime of Stalin, what would have awaited the country? To be honest, I think our past would be even darker. By sweeping away the Stalinists along with their reforms, the partocracy would have established such a pseudo-revolutionary, anti-people regime that it would certainly have cost even more victims in order to curb it. Our note: first, pseudo-socialist, not pseudo-revolutionary. It would have been completely revolutionary extremist. Second, maybe it would not have cost an even greater amount of victims in the years that have passed until now. But the fact that it would have been inter-Nazi Masonic fascism is for sure. And that would have been much worse than victims, since victims are a loss of quantity, while a stable fascist anti-people regime is a loss of quality, which would have required a much greater amount of victims in subsequent stages of history in order to break through the inter-Nazi Masonic global fascism to the human quality of life. Back to the quote. During the ideological struggle between two worlds, all the time they talked about several million victims of Stalin. Is historical science ready today to answer how many people actually fell into the millstones of repression? Not yet fully, but the limits of the cataclysm are already clear. Russian and foreign historians today agree that two waves of terror claimed 300,000 to 400,000 lives. Naturally, the first was much larger than the second. Komsomolskaya Pravda, November 20th, 2002. This is not the whole truth about that era. The whole truth simply cannot fit into any documentary. The result of the confrontation between different components of power at the end of the 1930s was such. True-believing Marxists in their majority were executed. Freemasons lost public power and curtailed their own public activity. Freemasons inside the country were forced to hide and prepare for conspiratorial activities. Before that, Freemasonry succeeded in the execution of a significant number of the most qualified professionals in all sectors of the economy and in the spheres of the life of society, which caused great damage to Bolshevism and the USSR, undermining the potential for its further development. The idealist bureaucracy recognized in J.V. Stalin its master, and this word, for many years, became an allegorical designation of the leader in the circles of the bureaucracy, which, with greater than ever fervor, in awe in front of him and hatred for him, began to create his cult of personality, in order to turn J.V. Stalin into its hostage, isolate him from the people, and cover its so-called politics with his authority. World Freemasonry took the course towards the organization of the war between Hitler's Germany and the USSR, the main purpose of which was to discredit any kind of nationalism for the future by the example of the atrocities of Hitlerism, to lead Bolshevism to a state catastrophe in the war, and to revive the Masonic regime in the USSR. Internal Freemasonry began to prepare for the defeat of the USSR in the war with the German-Japanese bloc. J.V. Stalin, understanding what was happening, began to prepare the country for war. But, along with this, measures were taken to ensure that together with Hitler's Germany, there was no other Germany then, they egress from this scenario of world politics, directed primarily against the peoples of both states. Unfortunately, Hitler violated the agreements and attacked the USSR. And this was not a provocation of the German military, showing its aggressiveness against Hitler's will. One of the main reasons for the military catastrophe of 1941 was that the commander of the Western Special Military District, General D.G. Pavlov, did not fulfill the directive of the General Staff of June 18, 1941, on the deployment of troops in accordance with the plan to cover the state border. Moreover, a detailed analysis of the course of hostilities on the Soviet-German front shows that D.G. Pavlov was not the only supporter of the Wehrmacht among the highest command personnel. The oddities in the behavior of the command, leading to defeats, ceased only in 1943, after the results of the Battle of Stalingrad demonstrated that Germany was not in a position to defeat the USSR. Although in the initial period of the war, the Wehrmacht and its command possessed massive real experience in modern warfare, and the armed forces of the USSR and their command did not have such experience in conducting military operations. Nonetheless, the stream of real inability to command troops in the initial period of the Great Patriotic War, in some cases, was the disguise of isolated acts of purpose-oriented sabotage of conduction of military operations. General D.G. Pavlov, in July 1941, came under investigation and was convicted of treason. Although at the trial he was able to write off his treasonous actions to unintentional negligence, which allowed the evasion of responsibility by other participants in the second layer of the military conspiracy, which was not revealed and not liquidated in 1937-1938. Coverage of this topic, however, is outside the scope of this material. The Khrushchev clique subsequently rehabilitated D.G. Pavlov, placing all responsibility for the military catastrophe of the summer of 1941 on J.V. Stalin personally, contrary to historical truth. However paradoxical it may seem, the first massively published source, which shows the colossal work done in the USSR in order to ensure victory in the war with Germany, even in the variants of more severe initial military defeats than in reality, are the books of V. Suvorov, V. B. Rezun, Icebreaker, Day M, Cleansing. In order to substantiate the version about the supposedly prepared Soviet strike against Germany, which Hitler allegedly thwarted with his attack, the orderers of this book had to tell the truth, that in military technical and military economic terms, The USSR had prepared for war and victory in it in the years after the terror of 1937-1938, as a result of which the fifth column was basically eradicated. Along with the rehabilitation of D.G. Pavlov in Khrushchev's times, the former People's Commissar of the Navy, N.G. Kuznetsov, was expelled from the fleet and began to suffer harassment. This was revenge for the fact that the Soviet Navy met the war on alert, and this fact rendered the myth of the sudden German attack on the USSR as nonsense in the minds of every thinking person. If one type of armed forces of the state encounters a war on military alert, but for others it starts suddenly, then this means that the branches of the armed forces for which the war is a surprise are under the command of traitors to the motherland, professionally not consistent and careless people, among the number of whom can also be counted the so-called Marshal of Victory, G.K. Zhukov, who headed the General Staff in the last 6 months before the war. The Leningrad affair was not fabricated either. Its participants, having exceeded their official powers, organized the Leningrad Trade Fair in January 1949, during which they rotted products worth 4 billion rubles, with an average salary in the country of about 1,000 rubles. In the course of the investigation, it was established that Kuznetsov, Popkov, Kapustin, Lazutin, Turko, Zakrzyevskaya and Mikheyev plundered public funds and used them for personal enrichment. Before that, on December the 25th, 1948, during a joint regional and city party conference, the voting results were fabricated. This was announced by the author of an anonymous letter to the Central Committee, the verification of which confirmed the fact of fabrication and the involvement in it of Popkov, Kapustin, Kuznetsov. Kapustin, while on an internship in England in 1935-36, entered into an intimate relationship with a translator. In the late 1930s, the brakes were put on the case of the extramarital affair. But in 1949, the State Security exposed the fact that Kapustin had been recruited by British intelligence during his internship and had spied in its interests, for which he was arrested. Popkov, a nominee of Voznesensky, heading the Moscow Party Committee, demanded that the ministers, as party members, be subordinate to him, which was, in essence, the intervention of Popkov and the group of bureaucrats behind him and their idea givers in the affairs of the all-Union and all-Russian bodies of power, that is, a real attempt to seize power. Voznesensky, heading the State Planning Committee, fabricated statistical reporting, conducted planning in such a way that he programmed the emergence of significant intersectoral disproportions in output. As a result, some sectors produced products for which there were no consumers in other sectors, which reduced the overall efficiency and useful return of the country's national economy. This was done in many respects in order to simplify the making of careers for their own people, on the basis of creating conditions for them to overfulfill their plans and suppress career opportunities for those who were unwanted. Additionally, the State Planning Committee revealed the facts of the disappearance of secret documents without a trace. From 1944 to 1949, 236 secret and top-secret documents disappeared, 9 of them in the secretariat of Voznesensky himself. It must be noted that the system of secret office work in the USSR provided for a documented recording of the facts of creation of secret documents in the process of work, the facts of the existence of each of them in the archives and with the executor personally, the facts of transferal of secret documents from one executor to another in the process of work, the facts of sending and receiving of documents by special mail, the facts of duplication of documents, the facts of destruction of each document as unnecessary, and the facts of changing or removing the stamp of secrecy. That is, every sheet, every photograph or drawing pasted into the brochure was registered with the document. Therefore, if in such conditions about 40 to 50 documents per year disappear without a trace in an institution, including documents containing several tens or even hundreds of pages, this speaks volumes. And at the same time, it was established that Voznesensky was personally involved in the concealment of such facts. That is, even if one takes political articles out of the prosecution, then some economic crimes and numerous facts of the disappearance of secret documents, including a copy of the state plan for the development of the national economy of the USSR for 1945, 209 A4 sheets, are quite sufficient in order to recognize the Leningrad affair not as inflated fabrication, but well-founded. In cadre politics, Voznesensky and Kuznetsov implemented the principle of their own team, promoting people loyal to them to positions without caring about the professional compliance of their protégés with the new positions. That is, they factually worked for the bureaucratization of power. However, even with such an approach to the Leningrad affair outside of politics, it is an indicator that the bureaucracy was a parasite, becoming an instrument of foreign political forces. And despite the fact that the Leningrad affair also expressed the struggle for power of various internal mafias of the bureaucracy and bureaucratic clans, it is also an act of social hygiene. And if we talk about the cult of personality in connection with the report on this topic by N.S. Khrushchev at the 20th Congress, then it was Kuznetsov, not to be confused with the People's Commissar of the Navy, and Voznesensky, who used the administrative resource in order to create the cult of their personalities. But in spite of this, N.S. Khrushchev, in his report, announced the Leningrad affair to have been fabricated. And this made it clear to the bureaucracy that an era of irresponsibility for incompetence, abuse of power, and self-interest of bureaucrats was beginning. That is, the entire report of N.S. Khrushchev is an indicator of the fact that he shielded Freemasonry, which, throughout the era of J.V. Stalin, acted in different ways in different spheres of the life of Soviet society. N.S. Khrushchev, with his report, shielded it as a factor in global politics. At the same time, the report was intended to solve three objectives: to demoralize Bolshevism, presenting J.V. Stalin as a monster, in order that people would be ashamed of their alleged involvement in the crimes of their leader; to revive the Masonic Marxist project; to appease the bureaucracy and make it completely subject to Freemasonry. Of these three tasks, it was possible to solve only the first, and even that, for a historically short period of time. Now, Bolshevism has freed itself from the power of Marxism and speaks its own language, as evidenced by the conception of social safety. The galvanization of the corpse of the Masonic Marxist project, killed by J.V. Stalin, did not take place due to the fact that the Marxist neo-Trotskyists of post-revolutionary generations showed a greater inclination to banquets and bardic songwriting, and did not at all want to perform revolutionary feats, risking their lives and their greater or lesser consumer welfare. By the 20th Congress, the party, Soviet and economic bureaucracies were tired of both revolutionary feats under the leadership of true-believing Marxists and of the fear in which they lived working for Bolshevism under the leadership of J.V. Stalin. Therefore, wishing for a quiet life for themselves, they quickly, by historical standards, got rid of N.S. Khrushchev, accusing him of the same sins of the cult of personality and professional incompetence of which he had accused Stalin at the 20th Congress. World Freemasonry was forced to accept this position of the Soviet bureaucracy since, from the beginning of the 1940s, it began to develop a new global revolutionary project, this time not on the basis of materialistic atheism, but on the basis of idealistic atheism, choosing for these purposes historically established Islam as an ideological platform. By the end of the 20th century, this global revolutionary project had begun to bear its first fruits. The history of recent decades shows that the United States works for it as stupidly, thanks to the mafia-Masonic nature of state power within it, as during the first half of the 20th century they worked for the Marxist project, first taking part in financing the revolutions of 1917 and, in the 1930s, providing the USSR with significant assistance in industrialization and then in its nuclear project, although the latter took place largely against the will and desire of the American bureaucracy. If we sum up the results of J.V. Stalin's activities, then, as Churchill said, he inherited Russia with a wooden plow and left it in possession of atomic weapons. J.V. Stalin fulfilled Lenin's parting words, reply to the notes of Sukhanov Himmel. The educational level of the population of the USSR became the highest in the world in the middle of the 20th century, although the quality of education, in the sense that it was still based on the biblical culture, remained unchanged. And although J.V. Stalin was unable to lead society to the victory of Bolshevik socialism, for this it was necessary, first of all, to rid society of the power of Marxism and the Bible over minds. Before leaving for another world, he left a parting word to the Bolsheviks of future generations, economic problems of socialism in the USSR, and pointed out a number of problems that need to be solved. De-Zionization, the fight against cosmopolitanism and the doctor's plot, of the life of society, and, above all, of its culture, which must be carried out without falling into the power of anti-Jewish racism and xenophobia. Elimination of the mafia character of the organization of science, Marxism and problems of linguistics, and in relation to the reply to the greetings of the workers of the chief railway workshops in Tiflis, the elimination of the Masonic mafia character of science as one of the branches of human activity. Debureaucratization of the sphere of governance.